thank you, and thank you for coming this evening. I hope I can entertain and inform you somewhat. If you're thinking about forensic linguistics, there's probably some of you in the room here who know something about what forensic linguistics is, and some of you who know very little about what forensic linguistics is. And there are many different definitions of forensic linguistics. We can talk about definitions of forensic linguistics which cover topics. And in our centre we have colleagues who work on the linguistics of the police interview and the linguistics of the courtroom. And we have colleagues who work on the interpreted interactions in judicial settings and so on. But the stereotype of forensic linguistics can be perhaps seen as being the investigative end. And probably the stereotype of that stereotype is doing authorship analysis work, taking an anonymous communication and trying to work out who wrote it, in some sense. And it's quite difficult to find a unifying definition for forensic linguistics. So what I've got here is my attempt at a unifying definition that can take in, not as a list of topics, but as an idea of what forensic linguistics is and is for. And it's quite a critical idea. It says that we should be helping with the delivery of justice through the analysis of language. And that delivery of justice can be to improve police interactions with suspects and witnesses. It can be to improve interactions in the courtroom. And it can be to deliver justice more directly by helping defence teams or police teams with investigations and preparing evidence for court. So this is the theme I want to dwell on a little and talk about how forensic linguists can help deliver justice or improve the delivery of justice. As I said, possibly the classic forensic linguistic activity is forensic authorship analysis. So I'm going to start with a demonstration, a very quick example of a forensic authorship analysis from a few years ago. And it involves the death of a woman called Amanda Burks. And this is a case I've written about quite a lot and spoken about quite a lot. And Amanda Burks died in a house fire in 2009 in Staffordshire. And almost from the off, the police were suspicious. What had happened was her husband phoned the police to say the house was on fire and his wife and children were in the house. And then he entered the house and rescued his children. But by the time the fire brigade arrives, they're unable to rescue Amanda, who's in a top floor bedroom. Very quickly, evidence built up that this story wasn't credible, this story wasn't true. So there was forensic evidence that came in from the pathologist report that Amanda hadn't breathed in much carbon monoxide. Okay, so she probably wasn't alive at the time the fire started. She was tucked up in bed, and there was some disputable fibre evidence that she was tucked up in bed wearing outside clothes. Okay, so this story of Christopher Burks, the husband, doesn't quite add up. Also, he says during that day he was out about their joint business, which was installing satellite TV aerials, and that she had been at home working, doing accounts and so on, and that she had been texting out instructions using her phone to the various work teams. There was some contradictory evidence to that story too. There was no movement detected on a domestic burglar alarm that was set. And then there was, of course, these text messages. Okay, so Christopher Burks' story was Amanda Burks had been using her phone to communicate with work colleagues, family and friends during the day of the 17th of January 2009. What we were asked is, are these text messages likely to be in the language of Amanda Burks? How do they compare with the previous text messages that had been sent from her phone? And how likely is it that they're in the language of Christopher Burks? Okay? And this is what CFL has specialised in. This is what my research is in, analysing what we now call short form messages, to take in Twitter messages, WhatsApp messages, all sorts of different social media, where the length of the message is somewhat limited. How do you go about it? it sounds like a very difficult case to do, but it's actually quite an easy case, okay? Because what you do is you can collect a large number of previous communications. So Amanda's phone was destroyed in the fire. So what the Stafford police did is they went round knocking on doors of the family and friends and saying, have you received messages from Amanda over the last 3 months? Can we collect those? Christopher Burks was unable to produce his phone for the police. He said he'd lost it in all the confusion. And so they did a similar job on him. And so they had about 200 messages previous to the fire from both of them. And with these text messaging cases, it can be enough just to do a vocabulary analysis, which is what I did in this case. So what we have here is a comparative analysis of the words used by Amanda Burks and Christopher Burks. So this is a little while ago, and texting abbreviations were more in then. Okay, so just to read a line or two, we've got WEN for when, which was mostly used by Amanda Burks. 70% of the use was Amanda Burks and 30% was Christopher Burks. And we've got other ones which will go the other way. We have some which are 100%, so it's only Christopher Burks who ever uses the abbreviation just, JST, and so on. What we're trying to do here is we analyse all the vocabulary and we're not cherry-picking the results, okay? So we have an algorithm for choosing what we put into this chart. So you have to prove consistency and distinctiveness, so they have to be repeated words. So they're words used more than 10 times in the overall corpus, and they have to be distinctive, so we go for a 2-to-1 ratio. So we go for the 70-30, 66-33% usage. And these are the only words that fall out of that analysis. Okay? And so what you can do then is a visual presentation. We can do the statistics as well, but this was prepared for the jury in the case, where we take Christopher Burks' messages on the day before the fire, okay? And what you have is the red items are items which are more Christopher Burks, and the blue items are items which are more Amanda Burks. Okay, you've got no use by Amanda Burks, rare use, which is at the 90-10%, and some use, which is between the 66 and the 90% use. Okay, so you're allowing some of each side to use one another's language. It's never absolute. There's always this variation in the mix. And what you see in these messages from Christopher's phone is you get mostly Christopher Burks features, as you'd expect. There's some features here that look like Amanda Burks, but that was one of the proportional features. And you can look at the same thing for Amanda's phone, and this is the day before the fire. And then we get on to the day of the fire itself. Okay, on this day, what you have at 11:39, that feature has never been used by Amanda Burks before. And you get down to 12:30 or so, okay, and you're having a mix of Amanda and Christopher Burks' features. This isn't enough to bring in a conviction, okay? But after 12:30 on that day, all the messages from Amanda Burks' phone go into Christopher Burks' style. And that is the evidence you can put before the jury. Okay, this is evidence that those later messages in the sequence of text messages are more likely, are consistent with the historic, the known texting style of Christopher Burks and inconsistent with the historic known texting style of Amanda Burks. Okay, so this is classic forensic authorship analysis. Okay, and what we have with this is we have a very real problem of how do we communicate this result to the jury? What's the language we use? You'll find writers in forensic linguistics writing about authorship attribution or authorship identification. I don't use that language. I only ever speak of authorship analysis. And the main thrust of my talk is why that's the case. I don't do attributions. Okay, so in this case, down this left-hand side here are the conclusions I wrote in my expert witness report. So Christopher Burks' habitual text messaging style is different from the habitual style of Amanda Burks. That chart I showed shows that. You can find differences between their two styles. The messages after the date are different from, show stylistic differences from messages sent by Amanda Burks before that date. You get a shift in the style, in the timeline of the messages as they come in. These are now inconsistent with Amanda Burks. And they show consistency with the known texting style of Christopher Burks. And it's important that that is all I say. I don't have evidence as an expert witness. I cannot stand there and say Christopher Burks wrote these messages. Okay? And it's important I don't, because in fact that's the jury's job to decide that. This presents to the jury a weight of evidence, and for the mathematicians in the room, you can present this as a Bayesian analysis, as a likelihood, yeah? It's a weight of evidence, yeah, that these messages were written by Christopher Burks, but that's not my job as an expert witness. My job is to present information to the jury that they couldn't have deduced otherwise to help them with their decision making. Now, more recently than that, in 2013, in a Birmingham court, in the Court of Protection, there was a dispute over a will. Okay, and it was who had written an informal will and how this would affect this family dispute. And there was authorship analysis done in that case, and it was in fact an American professor using a computational method in authorship analysis. And he appeared over video link from the States, and you can download the judgment online, and in that judgment it reports that the professor told me, this is the judge, that he was 99.99% certain that the author of PP's statement was the author of this letter of wishes, this will, essentially. Okay? I don't know how you can say that. I think that is overreaching as a forensic linguist. And I want to explain to you why that is overreaching, and hopefully by the end of the talk you will agree that no credible forensic linguist should use this language in court. Similarly, in 2015, I was involved in preparing as a rebuttal witness in an Australian civil case. And in that case, the opposing expert had written, letter 2 is grouped with author X's data with a probability of 100%. Okay? Now this is, I've already got you on my side, which is great, but we've got to think about this a bit. Okay? This is slightly more nuanced than the one above. This isn't talking about the authorship. This is saying that these texts are grouped with these texts. So it is slightly more nuanced, and I think we've got to appreciate that. But again, I want to present to you why this is an unhelpful way of drawing a conclusion. Okay? So this is what I'm setting up, and I want to explain to you why I think that these two individuals are overreaching, because they either don't have a particular strong theory of linguistic identity, or their theory of linguistic identity is too what we'd call essentialist. They believe that we are one individual that we present to the world the whole time. Okay? It's as if these people believe we have something which would be a linguistic fingerprint, which is unchanging. Okay? And I can very quickly say, I know that you use different language with your children, with your partner, in the workplace and so on. We know language changes. So what is this idea of a linguistic individual? What is the linguistic identity? Okay? Why can we say this but shouldn't say that? So I want to go a bit theoretical now into linguistic identity, and I thought the way to do that was to do some simple animations to explain what I believe a linguistic individual is. This is what Nikki and I are trying to write the book on at the moment, and we're trying to do a really applied book that also has a load of theory in it, and that's quite hard to write, I'm discovering. But it's also very, very good fun. Okay, so who am I? This is the basic question. Yeah, and you can ask yourself, who am I? How am I an individual? What makes me me? Okay? And one of the things that makes me me is interaction with other people. This is a very peculiar form of interaction. Don't do this all that often. Most of my teaching is more interactive than this, I'd like to say to the teachers in the room. Okay? But one of the things that makes me me is the person I talk to. So if I'm talking to this person over here, imaginatively called Red, our interaction shapes both of us. Yeah? The way I talk to one person will be different from the way I talk to another person because of the nature of our relationship and all sorts of interesting things about human beings. We don't relate to one another in the same way all the time. Okay? This is hopefully not controversial, and so therefore when I'm talking to someone else, the shape of the interaction, the shape of who I am, changes as we move into these interactions. And linguists study this, and we study how our interactions are partly designed by the audiences we're presenting to, and that we accommodate to one another's language style. And a lot of linguists do great work studying the minutiae of that interaction, yeah, and how we accommodate with one another. Okay, but if you're a forensic linguist, this creates a problem for you because you don't know which of these two is the real me. Okay, the real me is hard to pin down. Okay, and it gets worse than that, of course. It gets much worse than that. Okay, because this is the me at work. Okay, but as I've already said, when I'm in a pub, I don't speak like this. Okay, not for very long, or I'd get bottled or something. I don't know. Yeah, I can't use the same style of interaction in different contexts. And when I'm online, I'm different again. Okay? And for each of these contexts, I might not be talking with red. Yeah? I might be in a pub with yellow or online chat with yellow. Okay? So now there's lots and lots and lots of me's. Yeah? Who am I? Yeah? And how can I explain who I am? In terms of most contemporary linguists, and probably most contemporary sociologists and social scientists as well, would hold to a social interactionist view of identity. Okay, and it's beautifully summed up by two writers who are called Buchholz and Hall, and there's this great article in 2005 which you should all go away and read after having read all my stuff. And they basically have these 5 principles for who I am. Okay? So the first principle is that identities emerge from interaction. We've already seen that to some degree. Okay? Also, every interaction that I am engaging in positions me. It changes me. We get these different shapes of me. Okay? And the nature of the interaction, the content of the interaction, can signal those positions. Okay? They can tell us who someone is. And sometimes we do that by overt mention. You know, I'm a professor of forensic linguistics and I've been asked to give a talk. Yeah, that's an overt mention. But also, somehow, I'm commanding the room and I'm speaking without interaction. Okay, so that is more by the stance I have, and it's more an implied expression of my identity, allowed by the room. Okay, it's through the interaction, but some of it's more explicit, some of it's less explicit. Often identities are created relationally. That means similarity and different. I'm different from you, but similar to you, and so on. Yeah, but there are other relations we can discuss as well. And finally, Buchholz and Hall say that identities can be partial, and it's quite hard to pin down what they mean by this. What I take them to mean is that identity work in interaction is not always fully conscious. Okay, can be partially conscious, partially unconscious, partially deliberate, and partially habitual, and so on. But I'm not absolutely sure I'm understanding Buchholz and Hall as they would wish to be understood. But I think that's something like that they mean. And it's quite important to me. So when I'm all these people, this is a nice theory of identity that helps explain that. Okay? But it's also a little bit limited if you're a forensic linguist. Okay? Because I'm a different me in every interaction. Okay? This is about identity in the moment. Yeah, and every text, every interaction is a moment of identity performance, a moment of identity expression. And I take moment loosely. You know, I might write a 4,000 word paper, or I might have or you can analyze every turn in an interaction. Okay, but it's a momentary position. And my positions change depending on who I'm talking to and the circumstances and so on. And so that's problematic, because what I'm interested in as a forensic linguist is what persists, what stays the same, so I can identify it. The other thing that arises out of the Buchholz and Hall theory of identity is identity isn't about who we are, it is about what we do. we do identity. Identity performance is an activity which we engage in. All identities are emergent from interactions. Yeah, so it's something we do actively, it's not something that we just do in the moment. So, how do we do the identity performance? I think the way to understand identity performance is that we have a set of resources that we draw on to perform interactions in certain contexts. And so we can ask, can we enumerate those resources? What are these resources that we draw on? Okay? We've seen already, we draw on the other interactants. Yeah? If I'm interacting with a friend, I'm drawing on them to perform my identity. This is what linguistic accommodation, this is what anticipating the authorship is. I'm using them as a resource for my identity performance. Okay? Linguists also study how groups of interactants fall into habits. They align with one another. And one of the things we can call these are communities of practice. Okay? So the community of practice can also be a resource I draw on. Yeah, I'm drawing on the academic community of practice rather significantly to present this particular identity to you. Yeah? Now these resources are important for the performance of my identities in different circumstances, and I will draw on different communities of practice in different contexts. We've already seen how the context or the genre, the structures of the interaction will be something that shapes my identity performance. The way I'd like to pitch that is they are resources I can draw on. Okay, one example I use to explain this is that if you're a witness in court, yeah, of a sexual assault, yeah, the structure of the interaction allows you to perform the identity of victim much more easily than it does of survivor. Okay? If you perform the survivor identity, you will be constrained by the judge and the expectations of that interaction. Yeah? So, but if I want to perform the victim identity, then the structures of the interaction are resources there for me to draw upon. Yeah? And every interaction has these structures. Some are formal structures, which are easily recognised in the courtroom, but conversations have these structures. Informal conversations in the pub have these structures too. Okay. Then we get to the bit that's a bit difficult for most linguists. Okay, what are the other resources we draw on? Okay, the physical self. Okay, I'm performing the identity of professor, you know, and I'm a white man in a suit stood at the front of a room. It's easy for me. Yeah? That needn't be the case. Okay, there are other individuals who might try and occupy this territory, and they might have other resources to draw on, but they have to work to develop those resources. So the physical self is an identity resource, certainly in face-to-face interactions. Our appearance, our scruffiness or smartness, our physically observable gender, ethnicity, age, and so on, are all resources we draw on in our identity performances. The other bit that linguists are less likely to talk about is the bit of the physical self, which is your brain, your cognitions as well. Okay? So if language is essential to identity performance, I can limit your identity performance by damaging your brain. Okay? So there has to be a link there. Okay? Less devastatingly, yeah, all of us have developed cognitive systems which allow us to interact with others in the world. Okay? So the brain is a crucial resource we draw on in our identity performances. Okay. And finally, there are my various histories, my sociolinguistic histories. This is a timeline from baby to schoolboy to university student and so on. Okay? The sociolinguistic history will include my family history and the privileges or constraints that involves. It will include my educational history, my language that I use, and the varieties of language I have access to. Yeah, I can't perform an identity in Korean, because I don't speak Korean. So I can't draw on those resources in my identity performance. Okay? I spent quite a lot of time studying multicultural London English and street slang as used by criminal gangs. So I might be able to draw on those resources, but I'm not going to do so in this room. Okay? Geography plays a role. And linguists will refer to the geographic resources as our dialects. Okay, and there's also professional history, and there's other things as well. But we have this timeline that extends behind us, which create resources which we can then perform. Okay, the crucial point is, if I have this set of resources I'm drawing on, what I'm doing in any interaction is drawing on them differentially. I'm picking and choosing. It's like a selection of resources used in different ways to perform the identity for a particular instance. But also, the resources I draw on are constraints. There are identities I cannot perform because either I don't have those resources, I don't speak Korean, or they're not made available to me by the nature of the interaction. The rape victim witness trying to perform as a survivor in the courtroom. Okay? So the resources I choose constrain my identity performance as well as enabling it as resources I can draw on. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit too. The idea, so what we're developing here is what we are starting to call a resource constraint model of identity performance. And it's wholly interactive, it's interactionist in conception. Okay, so the question therefore arises, what is it that links things up? Yeah, how am I one person? I've said vaguely that I might be one person because of the resources I draw on, but which resources help with the persistence of my identity? Okay, the idea of a personal identity is of something persisting through time. And we might have doubts about other people, but we all know that for ourselves. Yeah, we have our own sociolinguistic history, our own cognitive systems, retain the memories that enable this. Okay, I think there are two main sources of persistence in terms of identity resources. There are the cognitive resources, and there are strong links between theories of idiolect, that's your individual language variety, and cognitive psycholinguistics and the brain as well. So cognitive psychologists, for example, it's a little old hat now, but do a lot of experiments on lexical priming, how using one word or circumstance or stimulus would enable you to recognise more quickly another word or circumstance. Yeah? And in linguistics, corpus linguistics, we can take the idea of lexical priming and recognise it in collocation. Yeah? One word predicts that the next word is coming. Yeah, and so in terms of my cognitive linguistic resources, I have a set of collocates that I use that are probably different from yours. Okay, so my psycholinguistic capabilities and my memory. The other main area of persistence of resource is my sociolinguistic history. Yeah, which has to be enabled by my cognitions. Yeah, but my personal route through life is different from yours. Even if I had a twin brother, that's true. Yeah? So these are the two things that can stay the same. Okay? And what's interesting about these two resource sets isn't that they're static, they're not static, but they change slowly. Who I choose to speak with from 1 minute to the next can change quickly. Yeah? But these things change more slowly, so they give me the persistence that I need in my personal identity. And so I've sort of got a theory of identity. I can tell you what your identity is, or my identity is. It comprises and is unified by the resources I can draw on in the moment and over time. This cloud of resources creates and informs this cloud of identities, but creates those persistent links. Okay. Which is all the very theoretical. You've got through the science bit now, the theory bit. Because how does this affect the authorship analysis? Okay, given that you all believe everything I've just said, here's hoping, okay, what the comparative authorship analysis is, yeah, it's about explaining where the sources of variation are. So in the Burke's case, Amanda Burke's, it was noticed by the police, in the first few texts they collected, would end her communications XXX, kiss, 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 yeah. What we noticed with the fuller corpus is that was only to her children. Utterly unsurprising. But you can't use that as an authorship marker. Yeah? You've got to explain the sources of variation, and you've got to understand them. And then you've got to explain the consistency that you observe and why that might be the case, and the distinctiveness and why different authors will draw on different areas of resource and draw on resources differently to create distinctiveness. And if you're talking about a husband and wife, that can be quite difficult. So authorship analysis is about the explanation of variation and the description of consistency and distinctiveness. And given all the variation that we've seen, I hope you're now agreeing with me that to say a 99.99% certainty of attribution is untenable. We simply don't know that. We can do an explanation to the jury. We cannot do that hard attribution, I believe. It can be different if you're working outside of the forensic context. We've got some students over the last year or so who've been working on a historic authorship problem, and it would be a really unsatisfying paper if they didn't end, and so we think X wrote it. Yeah, you've got to do that in those kind of contexts, but in the forensic context, that's not your job. Okay, and here I've written that these are the easier authorship cases. What makes them easy is it's a small group, a pair of people, you're looking for distinctiveness and patterns of consistency. We can go slightly bigger than that. We can go groups of 5, maybe 10. If you get towards 20, it gets really, really hard. And if you get to an open set, it gets near impossible. So how can forensic linguists help in these harder problems? Okay, let me put this up here. Now this image here requires some explanation. This image for me is a kind of an icon of 21st century evil, for want of a better word. Okay, this is an image that a child is being forced to hold up. The bit I've scrubbed out there is an identifier. Hold up on a live webcam so that an abuser at the other end can order the sort of abuse they want. Okay? And then on that piece of paper, you would write the abuser's username so that you know it's live and in the moment and you're not being conned as an abuser. Okay? How is this possible? Why is this hard for police or forensic linguists or anyone to detect these cases? Because if it was easy to detect, we would have chased down all these guys. And women. There are both genders involved in this. Okay? And one of the reasons it's hard is because of dark encryption on the internet. The dark web. Strong encryption on the internet. And some of you may have heard in the media Tor, about Tor browser. Tor stands for the onion router. Okay? And how Tor works is you have a series of layers, which is why it's the onion router. And you have the anonymous person here online, and they build an encrypted connection to this person who is just running the Tor browser on their computer, which enables an encrypted connection to this person, an encrypted connection to that person, and at every layer there is strong encryption, which means it's practically impossible to say what the IP address linking the client and the server is. Okay? I'm sure there may be computer scientists in the room who can explain that better. But the point is you have a chain of encryption, and each link in that chain is nearly impossible to break. Yeah, and so you put them together, and it's very difficult to break. And it relies on there being a certain number of people working with Tor browsers at the time. Okay? It was invented by the CIA, so their operatives could work anonymously in the field, and distributed by the CIA so that lots of people would use it. That's a handy fact. Okay? What happens, therefore, is you get these abuse bulletin boards that are very hard to find. An Australian case recently, there was a Tor-hosted bulletin board which had 45,000 anonymous members, and each of those members, as a payment for membership, had to produce more abuse images, new ones. Okay, so these are factories for creating abuse. Okay, a forum like this was closed down recently, and 3 days later, a new forum popped up and had 46,000 members. Okay, this is a massive and difficult problem. Okay, What we're wanting to do is look at the text represented by these identity presentations and work out what sort of person wrote this. Okay? Can we say anything about the physical self? Probably not, because the physical self is best understood as feeding into the sociolinguistic history. Yeah? So we can't tell whether someone is a man or a woman, but we can tell whether they're performing a male or female gender. So we can't profile their actual gender, their biological sex. We can only profile their performed gender. We want to turn around the performance and make predictions about the sort of person. Okay? What can we predict? Okay, I'm going to speed up just a little bit. First of all, there are the overt mentions, the explicit performances. So these are two texts from a Tor forum. The first one there is two offenders chatting with one another, saying that people who hurt children are the wrongdoers. There'll be a parallel forum where it's utterly sadistic and people who hurt children are valued, but in this forum, although they're sexually abusing these children, they see themselves as above that second group. Okay? So they are performing within their community of practice. You get performances of age. So in this case, the victim says, my mum's taken the camera off me. So that's a performance of age, which is relatively overt. Okay? This is a child speaking. Okay? But not all identity leakage is as overt as this. Okay, when I put up Anonymous is Dead as my title, this is what I was expecting. I was expecting to be hacked by lolsoc or something. Okay, lolsec, okay. This is actually the hackers who went for the Sony Corporation, okay, after they wrote a film about North Korea. And every year with our MA students, we run what we call CFLAG, the Centre for Forensic Linguistics authorship group. And this was a study done by the students of that year, led by Andrea Nini, who was one of our postdocs at the time. And so these are hackers using the dark web to hide their identity whilst communicating with the world about what they've done. Okay, so what can a linguist do? Okay, we can work out that these aren't native English speakers. There's errors here. Okay, the one I want to focus on is the uninflected B in passive subordinate clauses, which is going to thrill you. Okay? So let's go there. A passive voice, you know, the scientist invented it rather than it was invented by the scientist. Subordination, if the scientist invented it, and so on. You put those two things together, yeah? And what these people are doing, and they're going with the infinitive form, just to be. We continue till our request is met, would be an inflected response. Okay? These people's English is affected by another language they speak. And you can do a corpus study looking at corpuses of learner English to find out where this occurs. Okay? So this feature occurs in East Asian languages and not in Russian or Slavic languages. Okay? The hackers may or may not have been Russian. The people communicating are more likely to have been Korean. Yeah? That's what you can say from that sort of analysis. Okay. So, it's likely that this writer is drawing on the East Asian language competence as a resource for their performance of English, and is also constrained, and these two things are the same thing really. Yeah, the identity performance isn't conscious or deliberate. This is partial in the Buchholz and Hall theory. Okay? And we can do this for these cases too. Not everyone who's writing in English on the internet is a first language English speaker. We can profile region. This is Jack Greaves' work. Okay, so he's got 10 billion tweets from American English, which are all geotagged. And he does this spatial analysis, and you get this hotspot map, as featured on QI this week. Go back and look at it on iPlayer. Okay. And so these, where are tweets that refer to Iowa? Surprisingly, they're here. Yeah? No one else talks about Iowa. But it's not quite true that no one else talks about Iowa, because this is about relative use. Okay? So they do talk about Iowa and Texas and California, but at a much lower rate. Red indicates high use, blue, low use. And you can profile other things too. Where do they use the word bagel? Yeah, so you can pick up cultural patterns, and Jack's just an analysis on where people are talking about Trump according to their dialect features. Okay, so how can this help us? What we can do in this situation is take a list of words that an individual uses and we can map them. Now this is the next research project. This isn't a done deal. This is what Jack and I hope to be working on over the next couple of years. But you extract a set of likely words. The words you extract is really important, and these are ones that seemed likely to Jack and his assistant. Yeah, it's not rigorous, okay? And you plot each of those words. So scooched was one of the words, and that looks nicely in the northeast, but we've got a Californian bit. Some words are less unusual, besides, or less unusual to me as a British English speaker. That's got a much broader distribution of use. And some are all over the place. What happens if you stack these maps up? Okay, in this case, you can put all those maps together and you get something like that, which isn't great, but it's something. Yeah, that this writer is probably from the northeast of the United States. The research project we hope to be engaging in soon is how can we refine this and do this properly and reduce that concentric circle, help identify where someone's dialect background is. Might not be where they live now, but it's where someone's dialect background is. So the writer is drawing on their geographic background, their dialect as a resource and constraint. Yeah, I can't use scooched because I'm not from the northeast of America. Okay. So this is linguistic profiling. This is a classic case of linguistic profiling based on an idiom. Okay, this is a ransom note. Put the ransom in the green trash can on the Devil Strip at the corner of 18th and Carlson. Okay, and this is a story that's told and retold in your first forensic linguistics class. Okay, and what happened is an American forensic linguistic, who really is a forensic linguistic superhero, looks up the term in the Dictionary of American English and says Devil Strip is only used in Akron, Ohio. Okay, and so he asked the police, do you have a suspect from Akron, Ohio? They do. They kick in the door, they arrest him, and it was the guy. Okay, if only every case is as easy as this. Yeah, now here's the problem. Here's the limit of profiling. Akron, Ohio has a population of 700,000. Okay, who did the work here? The police creating a suspect list of a couple of hundred, one of which was from Akron, Ohio, or the forensic linguist as a superhero. Yeah, it's the intersection of the profiles where you get the answers. Yeah, this is a great story, but the population of 700,000 is important. Yeah, in this story, it's not an identification. So can we do better? What's the next research project look like? What I think we are aiming at, and we have some ideas of how to develop this, is an author search engine. Okay? So can we write an authorship analysis to create search terms that will help us find someone who's working on the dark web? Okay? We know something about what the authorship analysis should look like. You've got your dark web writer. We can access and capture his text. We do the authorship analysis to describe aspects of his identity. And then we put that into an author search engine which searches the clear web and finds similar writings, say, on Facebook. And because it's in the clear web on Facebook, we find the guy. Okay? And we find that that's the same as that, and it's this guy here. It's amazing when you use this icon how much less scary it is than the anonymous face, yeah? And most of anonymous look much more like this. Okay. This is a really, really tough problem. We've been trying to work on something recently which is operational to help do this kind of thing, and it is really, really hard to know what to do. We have some idea that the use of idioms and collocates is really useful for this. Okay, and we have some idea that refining profiles will be really useful for this. But I'm hoping that in the next 10 or 15 years we'll be able to do this. I don't think it's a short project. Maybe 5 to 10 years if we're really good. Okay, and get lots and lots of money. Any funders in the room? Yeah. Okay, so this is the idea of author search. But it raises a really important problem as to whether we should be doing this. Now, this is pretty big brother stuff. Yeah, who should we allow to be anonymous on the internet? Everyone? Why not? Yeah? And you get this classic idea of a right to privacy, which is enshrined in European rights. Yeah? Even when we all put our lives on the internet, we still have a right to privacy. And so I've got a right to put my life on the internet anonymously if I choose. Okay? And some areas of the internet are particularly fierce about this. So on Reddit, which is a big, really big internet forum, they have rules against doxing someone. Doxing someone is to document their identity offline. Okay? And you get trashed if you dox people, reveal who they really are. There's a real sort of ethical stance that doxing is wrong. You can talk about a sort of utilitarian balance of harms and goods. So sometimes intrusion, this sort of intrusion I'm talking about, might be seen as a lesser harm, yeah, than the harms of online child abusers. And I think most people would think that, okay? But it's still dangerous. And for me, I struggle with the idea that a lesser harm becomes a good. And we've been working with applied ethicists at Warwick University and a guy called Chris Athan. And he talks about the ethical residue that the utilitarian position leaves. I'm doing something bad, but it's not as bad as that. Yeah, and that's uncomfortable. And he's developed an idea for, which he applies to undercover policing and other covert operations, of what he calls an ethical liability model. And he takes the idea of self-defense. Okay, so if someone comes at you with a knife, most people's intuitions is ethically you can harm that person to stop them harming you. Okay, and that's not about a balance of harm. Their action means they take on that liability. Okay? They are liable in an ethical sense, not a legal sense, but an ethical sense, for the harm that they end up receiving. Now, I think this is an interesting idea, okay? And when you consider debates about privacy and intrusion, I think it's an idea that's missing from those debates. Okay, so if you take the authorship analysis world, we recently had the Italian author Elena Ferrante, who was exposed. She was writing anonymously, and she seemed to need that anonymous space to be creative, to produce the novels that everyone loved. And a journalist does the work and works at it and goes and reveals her to the world, and she says she's no longer able to work. Okay, that is something most people will believe is, on balance, a bad thing. You get your internet trolls, where there's a huge spectrum. You get people taking the mickey out of Ed Bull's performance on Strictly Come Dancing. Yeah, to me that seems fair game, and I don't really mind if people are doing that anonymously. Okay, but then you get celebrities who are pregnant who are sent pictures of dead babies. Yeah, so trolling isn't one thing; it's a real spectrum. Yeah, at some point, do your actions, what you say, or where you say it, does that lead to your liability to intrusive acts? Now, I can't provide the answers to those questions, but I think those are the social discussions we need to have about the online world, anonymity versus privacy. To think in terms of liability, what makes you liable? This clearly makes you liable for any action we can do to find you. This clearly doesn't. I'd like the ethicists to work on what are the criteria in the middle here that allow us to do so without having the dirty hands, the ethical residue. Okay, which leads back to what I said at the beginning, that forensic linguistics is an attempt to improve the delivery of justice. If we just de-anonymise Elena Ferrante, we're not doing that. Yeah? But if we de-anonymise the anonymous guy abusing children online, I think we can be very content we are. And that's where I want to stop. Thank you very much.